Well, good morning. I'm Buddy Creech, and I'm really excited to be giving this talk on pediatric COVID vaccines, a little bit about where we are and where we think we may be going. And by virtue of disclosures, let me just mention that I have served as a consultant to Pfizer, Moderna, Janssen, GSK, Cowan Investments, and Vir. And some of those are, I think, related to some of the work we'll be talking about today related to mRNA vaccines and pediatric vaccines for COVID in general. I do receive royalties from Up to Date, and I have grant funding both from the NIH and from CDC for a variety of work. And I think most germane to this talk, or most relevant to this talk, I served as one of the co-principal investigators for the Moderna KidCo study, which was the study of children from 6 months of age to 12 years of age for the mRNA 1273 vaccine. Well, this work for us, at least in pediatrics, really began in earnest in about 2020 in the fall. And during that time, we were really focused on the fact that there was a lot of movement towards finding a vaccine solution for adults, and rightly so. Adults have borne really the lion's share of morbidity and mortality from this pandemic. And yet several of us made the observation that even though we're at warp speed, which was the original name for COVID vaccine development, children weren't really going anywhere. And at first, I think it was really a reflection of us misunderstanding the epidemiology of COVID-19 infections in children. There was not yet a full appreciation of the burden of MIS-C, or multi-inflammatory syndrome, that was seen in both children and adults. There wasn't a full appreciation yet of long COVID. And maybe we were simply prioritizing the adults before we wanted to move it into children. But one of the things that came from this editorial was a call to make sure we had the work done of shell protocols that could be implemented once we knew we had an effective vaccine. And that's indeed why it happened, yet it was still slow because of our, I think, a misstep in understanding how significant this was in children. But again, as I mentioned, some of this is right. If we look at the share of reported infections that led to deaths, and we look at it by age, the 0 to 17-year-olds really represent a very small number in the case fatality, as opposed to the more than 50-year-olds, and certainly those greater than 60 or 65, in whom mortality was certainly the highest. With that being said, if we look at childhood deaths in the US from COVID-19 and compare it to other causes during that same time, COVID-19 was on par and is on par with what we might see from influenza and pneumonia. It's certainly less than other traumatic events of childhood like drowning, firearms, and motor vehicle deaths, but it's on par for other things for which a vaccine is part of the routine schedule for children. If we look now at the landscape, this is a very different landscape than in September of 2020 when that editorial was written. And now we have multiple choices for children as young as 6 months of age. And I show them here on this slide. For Pfizer, BioNTech, we're going down to 6 months to 4 years of age, recognizing that for Pfizer, it's a 3-dose regimen for children, in part because the dose has been turned down so much to protect against some of the reactogenicity that's seen, that in order to reach that level of immunogenicity, it's really right now at least a 3-dose schedule. For Moderna, it's a 2-dose schedule of their mRNA 1273 vaccine. And you'll notice that the age groups are a little different here. It's 6 months to 5 years versus 6 months to 4 years for Pfizer. That's an unfortunate regulatory step in terms of where those divisions were made. And it's certainly confusing for both parents and for providers. This is a time for me to caveat and say that in general, we simply give the vaccine for the age that the child is at the time of the vaccination. So the 4-year-old and 11 months age child, that child's going to get the 4-year-old dose of whichever vaccine they're supposed to be getting. Once they age up, they get the next vaccine, but you don't have to wait and you don't have to worry about the immunogenicity because they're at the extreme of an age. Once we get to 5 years of age and older for Pfizer, BioNTech, or 6 years and older for Moderna, these start to look a little bit more like the adult dosing of vaccines in terms of 2 doses regardless. And now over the last few days, we've seen authorization of the bivalent booster for those younger children, which is an important feature that we're just now seeing. So even now, this slide is becoming out of date. And then, of course, we have Novavax that's also approved for teenagers and adults. and we have the Janssen vaccine for 18 years and older. The real challenge right now is that vaccines are only as effective as the humans they go into. And so if we look at the percent of children who have completed a COVID-19 primary series by age, and these are recent data, these are data from the Kaiser Family Foundation, and they're as of November 2nd of this year. I think you can appreciate that those that are 12 to 17 years of age, the majority of individuals have completed their primary series in the US. If you look at the age 5 to 11 year age range, it's only in the mid 30s. If you look at those that are less than 5 years, we're really not doing very well in terms of those who are being vaccinated fully. And part of that is based on a lack of vaccine confidence for COVID-19 vaccines. 3 in 10 parents of children under 5 say they will get their vaccine as soon as possible. These were data from earlier in the pandemic, but in 2022, January is when the most recent data that I'm showing you here was. 31% would get them vaccinated right away, 29% would wait and see, 12% only if required, and 26% would say definitely not. Thankfully, that number is lower than what we saw in September 2021, where 35% would have said, oh, I'm definitely not vaccinating them. So I think as we're seeing some improvement in vaccine confidence along the way. But this is an important feature that we're seeing across the world. So if we ask the question, and these are data from 2020, if we ask the question in general, are vaccines important? Blue is great, orange and red, not so much, yellow's in the middle. You can see that most of the world on the left in 2015 would say that it was important, although there were some holes in China and in Russia and in other parts of certainly Eastern Europe, that vaccines maybe not as important as we would like people to think they are. But we'd actually moved the needle so that by 2018, the importance of vaccines was maybe more recognized. If we ask the question of parents, are vaccines effective? Now we start to get a little more troubling. We see lighter shades of blue, we see a little bit more yellow, and even more stretches of red, which shows a lack of confidence in the effectiveness of vaccines. And then finally, if we ask the question, do people think they're safe? Again, 2015 on the left, 2018 on the right, a lot of lighter shades of blue, shades of yellow, and even more orange. But again, as we look from 15 to 18, we were making some strides. Well, now we're in 2021. These are December data, so these are about a year old. And this is the rate of vaccine hesitancy across US zip codes. And again, blue is better, red is worse. That's not a political statement. It's just a matter of saying that red represents high rates of vaccine hesitancy, just like on the previous slide, it showed low rates of confidence. And I think what you can appreciate here is that, unbeknownst to us maybe, these red and blue colorations actually mirror some of the political climate in the US right now, where the coastal areas, the East and West Coast, major metropolitan areas, they tend to be bluer, which shows lower rates of vaccine hesitancy. There are some examples where that's not necessarily the case, like in the Pacific Northwest, which would lean more politically progressive, but have some degrees of pockets of vaccine hesitancy. But I think you can appreciate that in the Southeast, the Midwest, and even in the Pacific Northwest to some extent in the Intermountain West, that there are higher rates of vaccine hesitancy than we would like. And now this is for all vaccines. What we have to recognize is that as decreased confidence in COVID vaccines have come across our clinics, we also see a decreased confidence in other vaccines. So let's start with the question of why should we even vaccinate children against COVID-19? And I think it's really important that we recognize that we would see fewer missed days of school, fewer infections and deaths. That's a good thing. Fewer complications of infections such as long COVID, myocarditis, or MIS. And I think importantly, reduced likelihood of spreading COVID to family members and others, whether that's a grandparent, a member of the household that's immunocompromised, or whatever it might be. And I think we've got to frame our vaccination conversations in terms of these aspects of improvement. Are we trying to keep children from having these high case fatality rates? Well, they don't have high case fatality rates, but there are children, and we can't predict who they are, who are going to have bad outcomes from COVID. So let's prevent that through vaccination. As we think about how we would go about doing all of this, this is where some of our experience running these clinical trials of mRNA-1273 vaccine and others come across. So let me start with KidCove. This was a study that we published not long ago in 2022, looking at a classic pediatric vaccine study, which is age, de-escalation, and dose escalation. So we start in the oldest age group, in this case 6 to 11-year-olds, and we use the lowest possible dose that we think might be effective. In this study, we looked at 25, 50, and 100 micrograms, 100 micrograms being the adult dose of vaccine. Once we established that a low dose was safe in that age group, we can start to age de-escalate and go to the next cohort of 2 to 5-year-olds, and eventually those that are 6 months to 23 months of age. And in part one, again, this was an open label dose escalation, age de-escalation study of about 1,200 children. And then in part two, it was randomized 3 to 1 to receive either vaccine or placebo. And the goal was to have about 4,000 in each group. Let me start with safety, because we talked about how some parents really have concerns and primary concerns about the safety of vaccines. And what I think you can see here highlighted is that grade 1 or mild pain at the injection site was very common, and it was more frequent after injection 2. Now, about half of children experienced pain at the injection site from placebo, but nearly everybody had some degree of pain at the injection site, and some of them were moderate. They needed some type of intervention like Motrin or Tylenol, and just a couple were severe, a little bit worse after the second vaccination. The second is that fatigue and headache were common after the second dose. And let me highlight these for us. Again, green is grade 1, blue is grade 2, orange is grade 3. And I think what you can appreciate is that fever was a bit more common after second dose. 24% of children had symptoms after second vaccine. Just over half of those who received their second dose of vaccine had headache. About 2/3 had fatigue. And what we saw in the clinical trials were parents coming in saying, you know, my child was pretty sleepy the next day and took an extra long nap of maybe an extra hour or so. No parent complained of that. They were okay with it. We didn't see encephalopathy. We didn't see altered mental status. We simply saw increased napping afterwards. If we look at vaccine efficacy over the first 100 days, that's the second thing after safety, we can appreciate that vaccine efficacy is similar to the vaccine efficacy seen in adults. And whether we use CDC definitions or study definitions, we can see that the rates of disease in the mRNA-1273 group are lower than the rates in placebo, and it corresponds to an 88% vaccine efficacy. So then when we compare that across other groups, we can see similar immunogenicity of the mRNA-1273 vaccine 1 month after a 2-dose primary series in all the age groups that we see. So when we compare it to 18 to 25-year-olds in the parent COVE study, we can appreciate that whether we're looking at adolescents, children 6 to 11, children 2 to 5 years of age, or infants and toddlers, and with their corresponding decreases in dose once you get to 11 years of age, 50 micrograms or a half dose versus a quarter dose in those 5 years of age and younger, we can see very similar geometric mean concentration ratios across those age groups, and in fact, maybe slightly higher in those that are infants and toddlers. So where are we going at this point? So the first unresolved issue I think we have for pediatrics is, do we have the right Goldilocks dose for pediatrics? I think we've experienced from the Pfizer data that we may have gone just a little bit too low at 1/10 of the dose, and that necessitates a third dose of vaccine that we don't have to have with the mRNA-1273 vaccine from Moderna. The second issue is whether or not we should consider extending the primary series to even greater than 8 weeks. Recall that for Pfizer, the minimum interval is 3 weeks. For Moderna, it's 4 weeks. But now the ACIP recommendations give some leeway around that. It's 3 to 8 weeks, 4 to 8 weeks for Moderna. I think that's really important because we recognize that for almost every vaccine, being able to give a slightly longer interval between doses 1 and 2, while it may increase the risk period, it usually results in greater immunogenicity, both in the height of the antibody response as well as the breadth, because we're allowing for somatic hypermutation and additional maturation of the response to occur. So 2 doses a little bit further apart, that may actually be advantageous. And what we hope to see at a large scale once we make these changes is a decrease in the incidence of some of the post-vaccine reactogenicity that we see, whether that's the mild reacto like fever or fatigue and headache, or whether it is some of the more significant things like post-vaccine myocarditis. The second is boosters. What frequency of boosters are we going to have to prevent hospitalization, severe disease, or long COVID? I think it's important that we recognize that we have not cracked the code for the prevention of the common cold. What we have done is made incredible strides at turning a pandemic virus leading to incredibly high case fatality rates in some age groups to something that is far more tolerable, and we have greater tools to treat now. I think this is really important as we think about counseling parents, especially those that have decreased confidence in the vaccine, because I think those vaccines that we needed to be able to fully prevent disease, we've gotten pretty good at those. Those are the measles and the polios of the world. The ones that remain, we may not be able to prevent as well as we do protect. And those are the influenzas and the RSVs and the COVIDs of the world. And so we've really got to make sure our messaging is consistent with what our vaccines can do. The third is safety. And you're going to hear about this in just a moment, but myocarditis remains, I think, the most important adverse event following immunization that we're seeing with mRNA vaccines, at least in young men. And the exact pathogenesis is still a bit elusive, but what we are finding in general is that these children do very well in the short term, sometimes not requiring the types of therapy that we would typically need for myocarditis. And we may be able to decrease the risk of myocarditis, again, by spacing out the interval between those two doses. And I think we bear that out when we see decreased rates of myocarditis after the booster dose. And then finally, co-administration. We certainly allow it, but systematic data are now only just coming in. And we think we really want to be careful about increased reactogenicity that we may see with some vaccines. And this is where we think about pneumococcal vaccine with influenza or the combination MMRV product causing febrile seizures. We have to be really thoughtful about how we do these co-administration studies. So with that, in this brief overview of where we are with pediatric vaccines and maybe how we got there, I want to thank my team for the work they did to lead these studies, both in the adult population as well as the pediatric study. On the nurses on the top left, this is Teal Tuesday, which I do not participate in because I should not be wearing teal scrubs, and some of our broader team on the right. So with that, I'll finish, and I'll look forward to taking your questions in just a moment.